A cold dawn settles over the highlands of northern Ethiopia. The mountains around Adwa rise slowly out of the dark, their ridgelines sharp, ancient, and indifferent. Below them, thousands of men move through the thin air, boots scraping stone, rifles wrapped in cloth to keep the metal from flashing. From a distance, the scene is quiet, too quiet for what is about to happen. Across the valley, Italian camps still sleep, their officers convinced that history is already written. In Rome, newspapers have assured the public that this will be quick. Civilized order against primitive resistance. A lesson, not a war. What none of them understand, not yet, is that by the end of this day, an empire's confidence will lie shattered across these hills, and the world's assumptions about Africa will be forced to change forever. Before the first shot is fired, the defeat has already been prepared, layer by layer, year by year, inside the minds of European planners. In the late 19th century, imperial doctrine rests on an idea repeated so often it becomes invisible, that African societies cannot organize modern warfare. That belief is not casual prejudice. It is written into military manuals, diplomatic cables, and officer correspondence. In Italy, the newest and most insecure of Europe's colonial powers, the idea is clung to with particular intensity. Italy wants proof that it belongs among empires. Ethiopia looks like the easiest place to find it. Italian politicians speak openly of a backward kingdom, frozen in time. Officers dispatched to East Africa describe Ethiopian soldiers as brave but disordered, courageous but incapable of coordination. They reassure themselves that modern rifles alone decide wars, that discipline belongs exclusively to Europe. These assumptions harden into certainty as they pass from Rome to the colonial command in Eritrea. By the time Italian troops march south, contempt has already replaced caution. This is the story you'll want to follow closely all the way to the end, because what unfolds here is not just a battle. It's a rare moment when arrogance collides with reality so completely that it leaves written proof behind. Stay with this story, because by the final scene, you'll see how laughter turned into panic, and how an empire discovered, too late, that it had mistaken its own myths for facts. In European capitals, Ethiopia is rarely discussed as a state. It is described as a space, unclaimed, underdeveloped, awaiting direction. Maps reduce it to blank interiors and uncertain borders. When diplomats reference its ruler, Menelik II, they do so as if he were a tribal chief presiding over loose loyalties rather than a monarch commanding a centralized court. The Italian press mocks the idea that such a kingdom could stand against a European army. Political cartoons depict barefoot warriors scattering at the first cannon blast. Laughter becomes policy. Inside Italy's colonial administration, this contempt shapes every decision. Logistics are underestimated. Reconnaissance is treated as optional. Italian commanders assume Ethiopian forces will dissolve under pressure, retreating into hills as irregulars always do, according to European memory of earlier colonial wars elsewhere on the continent. No serious plan exists for facing a coordinated enemy force in overwhelming numbers, because such a force is assumed not to exist. Even warnings are filtered through disbelief. Reports of Ethiopia importing modern rifles from France and Russia are downplayed. Advisors insist the weapons will be poorly used, wasted on untrained men. The idea that African soldiers could master European arms as effectively as Europeans themselves is dismissed without discussion. Racial ideology does not merely influence strategy, it replaces it. At the center of this failure stands Italian General Oreste Baratieri, a veteran officer who understands the risks better than most. Baratieri is not blind to Ethiopia's strength, but he is trapped inside a system that rewards confidence and punishes hesitation. Rome demands action. Politicians fear embarrassment more than defeat. To delay is to admit doubt, and doubt has no place in imperial fantasy. Under pressure from above, Baratieri convinces himself that boldness will compensate for uncertainty. Across the Ethiopian highlands, that fantasy sounds almost absurd. Ethiopia is not a loose collection of tribes stumbling toward battle. It is an empire with centuries of military tradition, hardened by internal conflict and external threat. Its soldiers are not strangers to discipline or command. Many have fought in organized campaigns before. They know this terrain in a way no foreign army ever could. Yet none of this penetrates Italian planning in a meaningful way. European officers measure Ethiopia against outdated stereotypes rather than current reality. Contempt also poisons diplomacy. When Italian officials speak of treaties, they speak as if interpretation belongs exclusively to them. When Ethiopian envoys resist, their objections are dismissed as misunderstandings. Proof, Italians say, of political immaturity. At no point does Italy seriously consider that Ethiopia understands exactly what is being taken from it. To acknowledge that would require seeing Ethiopians as equals, and equality would unravel the entire imperial logic. This mindset is not unique to Italy, but Italy will pay the price for it most publicly. Other European powers watch with interest, some quietly skeptical, others amused. Few expect the outcome to matter. Colonial defeats happen, but not at the hands of African states acting independently. That assumption will not survive what comes next. As the Italian army moves closer to Adwa, its confidence remains intact. Officers joke in letters home. Soldiers pose for photographs beside artillery, convinced these images will soon be souvenirs of conquest. They are marching into history with smiles on their faces, unaware that they are about to provide the clearest possible evidence that Africa was never as defenseless as empire claimed. When the sun finally rises over the mountains, it reveals not the scattered resistance Italy expected, but something far more unsettling: an organized force stretching across the high ground, patient, silent, and prepared. The laughter has not stopped yet, but it is about to. While Italian officers reassure themselves in distant camps, Ethiopia is doing something European planners never truly account for: preparing, deliberately and systematically, for a war it fully expects to fight. This preparation does not look like Europe's imagination of Africa. It is not chaotic, improvised, or symbolic. It is logistical, political, and grounded in an understanding of modern power. At the center of this preparation stands a court that functions with remarkable cohesion. The Ethiopian Empire of the 1890s is not a loose federation held together by fear or ritual. It is a state shaped by decades of consolidation, diplomacy, and internal reform. Authority flows outward from the imperial center through a network of regional leaders bound by obligation, reward, and shared survival. Orders are carried by messengers who know the land intimately. Supply lines follow routes used for centuries. When mobilization begins, it is neither rushed nor confused. It is anticipated. The Italian mistake begins here, assuming that modernization must look European to be real. Ethiopia's modernization is selective, strategic, and deeply intentional. Weapons are imported, not as symbols, but as tools meant to be mastered. Tens of thousands of modern rifles enter the country through carefully managed channels. Ammunition stockpiles are guarded, distributed, and conserved. Artillery pieces, though limited in number, are positioned where terrain can amplify their effect. This is not an army dazzled by foreign technology. It is an army incorporating it into an existing martial culture. At the imperial court, Empress Taitu Betul plays a role European observers consistently underestimate. She is not a ceremonial presence. She is politically astute, fiercely protective of Ethiopian sovereignty, and unflinching in her assessment of Italian intentions. Where some see negotiation, she sees encroachment. Where diplomats speak of compromise, she hears subjugation. Her influence hardens imperial resolve at critical moments, ensuring that hesitation does not fracture unity. This unity matters more than numbers alone. Ethiopia's strength does not lie merely in the size of its army, though it is vast, but in its ability to bring regional forces together under a single strategic purpose. Provincial leaders who might otherwise rival one another are drawn into a shared defense of independence. Loyalty is reinforced not by ideology alone, but by memory. Ethiopia has fought foreign intrusion before. It understands the cost of division. At Adwa, fragmentation would mean extinction. Among the commanders moving men toward the northern front is Ras Makonnen, a seasoned leader whose understanding of maneuver warfare rivals that of any European officer he will face. His forces are disciplined, accustomed to long marches, and trained to fight in coordinated formations across broken terrain. These are not men waiting to charge blindly. They are waiting to be used deliberately. European observers struggle to interpret what they see because it does not fit their framework. Ethiopian soldiers do not drill in parade squares or wear standardized uniforms, so Europeans assume the absence of discipline. They fail to recognize alternative systems of command, verbal signals, horn calls, messenger relays that function effectively within the environment. What looks informal to an outsider is, in practice, adaptive. Ethiopia's army is built for its land, not for display. Crucially, Ethiopia also understands time. It does not rush to meet Italy on Italian terms. Menelik's strategy is patient, allowing Italian forces to extend supply lines, exhaust provisions, and expose themselves to the limits of their planning. Ethiopian armies gather slowly, deliberately, ensuring that when they converge, they do so with overwhelming presence. This patience is mistaken for indecision by Italian commanders eager for engagement. Diplomatically, Ethiopia is no less modern. Menelik communicates with European powers directly, cultivating relationships that complicate Italy's ambitions. France, Russia, and Britain all recognize Ethiopia as a legitimate state actor, even when they disagree on its future. This recognition matters. It means Italy cannot act without scrutiny. It means defeat will not be quietly ignored. Yet Italian leaders press forward anyway, confident that victory will erase diplomatic concerns. What Italy never fully grasps is that Ethiopia is fighting for existence, not prestige. This difference shapes everything. For Italy, defeat would be embarrassing. For Ethiopia, defeat would mean subjugation, loss of sovereignty, and the erasure of a civilization that understands itself as ancient and continuous. That awareness sharpens resolve. It clarifies priorities. It removes the option of retreat. As Ethiopian forces mass near Adwa, the scale becomes impossible to hide. Scouts report tens of thousands moving with purpose. Supply caravans stretch across the highlands. Camps are established with order, not chaos. Yet Italian commanders cling to familiar beliefs, insisting that numbers alone mean little without European discipline. They interpret Ethiopian strength as illusion, just as they have from the beginning. In this moment, two worldviews stand opposite one another. One is built on assumption, hierarchy, and inherited certainty. The other is built on adaptation, memory, and survival. Italy believes history is on its side. Ethiopia knows history is watching. When the armies finally draw close enough to see one another clearly, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. Ethiopia is not what empire imagined. It never was. And the ground beneath Adwa is about to make that fact undeniable. The march to war does not begin with gunfire. It begins with ink, paper, and a deliberate distortion of language. Years before armies gather at Adwa, Italy and Ethiopia sign what appears to be a routine diplomatic agreement. One of many treaties exchanged between African states and European powers during the scramble for influence. On its surface, it promises friendship, trade, and recognition. Beneath that surface, it becomes a fault line. In the Italian version of the treaty, a single clause quietly transforms Ethiopia into something it has never agreed to be, a protectorate. Rome reads the text as granting Italy control over Ethiopia's foreign affairs, effectively placing the empire under European supervision. In the Amharic version, the same clause is conditional, permission, not obligation. Ethiopia may use Italy as an intermediary if it chooses. The difference is not linguistic confusion. It is political intent. When Menelik rejects Italy's interpretation, the response from Rome is swift and revealing. Italian officials do not ask whether they have misunderstood. They declare that Ethiopia has violated international norms. The accusation is framed as betrayal, not disagreement. This framing matters. It allows Italy to recast its own aggression as enforcement. Diplomacy becomes theater, and the script demands escalation. At the Italian colonial headquarters, frustration replaces patience. Officers complain that negotiation has failed because Ethiopians are unreliable partners, too emotional, too proud, too resistant to instruction. Once again, contempt fills the space where analysis should be. The idea that Ethiopia understands the treaty perfectly and rejects it on principle is dismissed as impossible. To accept that would mean acknowledging Ethiopian sovereignty as equal and informed. Italy's decision to march south is justified to the public as inevitable. Newspapers describe a necessary intervention to restore order and honor. Politicians speak of credibility, of teaching a lesson before other colonies grow restless. What they do not say is that Italy is now trapped by its own narrative. To back down would be to admit that an African empire has forced a European power to retreat through diplomacy alone. That humiliation is deemed unacceptable. On the ground, Italian forces advance cautiously at first, then with growing urgency. Supply lines stretch across unfamiliar terrain. Maps prove inadequate. Paths marked as roads vanish into rock and scrub. Local intelligence is unreliable, filtered through intermediaries who often have little incentive to assist an occupying force. Still, commanders push forward, convinced that presence itself will force Ethiopia to submit. Ethiopia responds not with panic, but with clarity. Menelik understands that negotiation has reached its limit. The treaty dispute has revealed Italy's ultimate aim, not partnership, but control. Once that aim is clear, compromise becomes impossible. The imperial court shifts fully to war footing, not as an act of defiance, but of survival. What follows is not a reckless charge toward confrontation, but a measured alignment of political and military objectives. Ethiopian leaders agree on where and when to engage. They refuse to be drawn into piecemeal skirmishes. They allow Italian columns to advance just far enough to expose their vulnerabilities. Patience becomes a weapon as powerful as any rifle. Italian General Baratieri grows increasingly uneasy. He recognizes that his position is deteriorating. Supplies are low. Morale wavers. Ethiopian forces are larger than expected and more coordinated than predicted. He requests permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Rome refuses. The government demands action. Something decisive. Something visible. Delay is now seen as weakness. Here, arrogance hardens into fatal error. Baratieri is ordered to attack, not because conditions favor it, but because imperial confidence requires it. Strategy yields to symbolism. Italy must prove its superiority, even if the proof is staged on unfavorable ground against an enemy it still refuses to respect. The decision to advance toward Adwa is framed as boldness. In reality, it is desperation masked as resolve. Italian columns are divided to cover more ground, assuming Ethiopian forces will scatter under pressure. Communication between units is strained. The terrain, steep and broken, turns coordination into guesswork. Each decision is made on the assumption that the enemy cannot exploit mistakes. Ethiopia is counting on those mistakes. As night falls before the battle, Italian troops move into position, unaware that Ethiopian scouts track every step. Fires are lit and extinguished. Orders are whispered. Across the hills, Ethiopian forces wait, not in confusion, but in silence. They know where the Italians will be by dawn. They know how the terrain will shape the fight. They know that Italy has already committed itself too deeply to turn back. The final march to war is not driven by misunderstanding, but by refusal. To see, to listen, to reconsider. Italy advances not because victory is assured, but because pride has eliminated alternatives. Ethiopia stands ready not because it seeks conquest, but because retreat would mean the end of independence. By the time the first light touches the mountains of Adwa, diplomacy is no longer possible. Words have failed. Assumptions have hardened into orders. And an empire has placed its fate in the hands of beliefs that are about to be tested against reality. The battle begins before either side fully understands that it has begun. In the dark hours before dawn, Italian columns move out of their camps, navigating narrow mountain paths by memory and imperfect maps. Orders are carried verbally from unit to unit, already distorted by distance and fatigue. The plan, if it can be called that, relies on precision timing and mutual support across terrain that defeats both. Almost immediately, the columns drift apart. The mountains of Adwa are not passive ground. They fracture movement, swallow sound, and turn short distances into exhausting climbs. Valleys conceal entire formations. Ridges block visibility until forces are nearly upon one another. Italian officers assume they are advancing cautiously towards scattered resistance. In reality, they are walking into a converging mass. As daylight spreads across the highlands, Ethiopian forces reveal themselves, not all at once, but in waves, cresting hills, filling ravines, appearing where Italians believed nothing could move unseen. The scale is overwhelming. What Italian commanders had dismissed as rumor now stands before them in solid ranks of men, rifles at the ready, formations holding under command. This is not the disordered rush Italy prepared for. This is deliberate encirclement. Italian units attempt to form defensive positions, but separation proves fatal. Artillery cannot be coordinated effectively. Ammunition runs low faster than anticipated. Messages sent for reinforcement vanish into the terrain, unanswered. Each brigade fights its own battle, unaware that others are already collapsing. The assumption that European discipline alone guarantees cohesion dissolves under pressure. Ethiopian forces exploit elevation and mobility with precision. They strike from above, using terrain to neutralize Italian firepower. They press where columns are weakest, Withdraw where resistance stiffens, then return with greater force. Commanders communicate through systems refined over generations of warfare in these very mountains. Horn calls echo across valleys, carrying orders that Italian ears cannot interpret but feel in the sudden shifts of pressure along the line. What had been imagined as a demonstration of imperial authority becomes a fight for survival. Italian officers struggle to maintain order as formations break apart. Soldiers fire until rifles overheat, then fall back, only to find their retreat cut off. The enemy does not scatter. It closes in. There is no single moment when the battle turns. There are dozens. A unit overwhelmed on a ridge. An artillery battery captured after its escort collapses. A command post overrun before orders can be issued. Each loss compounds the next. Italian courage is not absent, but it is isolated. Pockets of resistance swallowed by a force that understands how to apply pressure without pause. For Ethiopian soldiers, the fight is not driven by frenzy, but by purpose. This ground is theirs. The stakes are absolute. Defeat would mean occupation, humiliation, erasure. Victory means survival, not just for a ruler or a court, but for a civilization that has refused to bend. That clarity steadies movement and sharpens resolve. By midday, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Italian lines collapse entirely in several sectors. Attempts at organized withdrawal disintegrate into desperate flight. Men discard equipment to move faster. Officers lose control, then lose their units altogether. What remains of the Italian army retreats in fragments, pursued through terrain that offers no mercy to the exhausted. The silence that follows is heavy, broken only by the wind moving through the mountains and the distant sounds of regrouping forces. The battlefield tells the story plainly. Modern rifles did not decide the outcome, nor did sheer numbers alone. What failed here was assumption, the belief that superiority could be declared rather than earned. Italy's defeat is total. Thousands are killed or captured. Entire brigades cease to exist as functional units. The colonial army, so confident in its inevitability, is dismantled in a single day by an opponent it refused to understand. The laughter that once filled newspapers and correspondence has no place left to go. As the smoke clears, Ethiopia stands in control of the field, not in triumphal chaos, but in disciplined order. Commanders account for their forces. Messages are sent. The war, for all practical purposes, is over. An empire has tested its certainty against reality, and lost. Adwa does not merely disprove a strategy, it exposes a worldview. It shows, with undeniable clarity, that contempt is not strength, and that racial doctrine offers no protection against preparation, unity, and resolve. The mountains have answered the question Europe refused to ask. And the answer will not stay contained on this battlefield. The shock travels faster than the news itself. In Rome, the first reports arrive confused, contradictory, softened by disbelief. Officials search for reassurance in the margins, mistakes in translation, exaggerations by correspondence, isolated setbacks misread as catastrophe. But the facts refuse to bend. An Italian army has not merely lost, it has been destroyed by an African state acting alone. Parliament descends into crisis. Questions spill from the chamber into the streets. How could this happen? Who is responsible? Newspapers that once promised glory now struggle to explain humiliation. Political careers collapse alongside public confidence. Italy's claim to imperial legitimacy, already fragile, fractures under the weight of Adwa. For a nation desperate to prove itself among Europe's powers, the defeat cuts deeper than any battlefield loss. The reckoning does not stop at Italy's borders. Across Europe, the reaction is quieter but no less profound. Military planners study the reports carefully, stripping away racial assumptions in search of explanation. Some refuse to accept the implications. Others cannot ignore them. An African empire has mobilized, modernized selectively, coordinated mass forces, and defeated a European army in open battle. This is not an anomaly. It is a precedent. Diplomatically, the outcome is irreversible. Italy is forced back to the table, no longer as a claimant, but as a petitioner. The Treaty of Addis Ababa formally recognizes Ethiopia's full sovereignty. The protectorate claim vanishes. What Europe once tried to take by reinterpretation must now be acknowledged in plain language. Ethiopia remains independent, not as an exception granted by empire, but as a fact imposed by victory. Inside Ethiopia, the response is measured. There is relief, pride, and mourning, but little excess. The leadership understands what has been preserved, and how narrowly. Independence has been defended, not guaranteed forever. The empire does not celebrate illusion. It remembers cost. The dead are accounted for. The wounded are tended. Authority is reinforced, not relaxed. Survival has sharpened, not softened, political awareness. Beyond statecraft, Adwa begins a quieter journey into imagination. Across Africa and the diaspora, the news moves like a current. In places where colonial rule feels inevitable, Ethiopia's victory becomes proof that inevitability is a lie. Intellectuals, activists, and ordinary people draw strength from a single, undeniable fact. Empire can fail. Not through accident, but through resistance grounded in unity and preparation. This is what makes Adwa endure. It is not just a battle remembered for its scale or its surprise. It is remembered because it exposes the mechanics of arrogance. It shows how power that relies on contempt blinds itself. How assumptions, repeated long enough, replace reality. Italy did not lose because it lacked courage or technology. It lost because it refused to see its opponent clearly. For European empires, Adwa lingers as an uncomfortable anomaly, one that does not fit the narrative of progress and dominance. For Ethiopia, it becomes something else entirely. A line drawn through history, marking a moment when sovereignty was defended not by isolation or luck, but by deliberate choice and collective action. The mountains around Adwa remain unchanged. The paths still wind through stone and shadow, but the meaning of that place has never been the same. On those ridges, an empire learned that belief is not power. Preparation is. Unity is. And Africa, long dismissed as incapable, proved it did not need permission to stand.